Yeah, that sounds great. It's pretty casual. So I'll just be kind of talking about my life story and how I founded my nonprofit and how I wrote the book. And then after that, we can just get into a Q&A, if that sounds good.
Great, thank you.
And then if there's something funky happening with my phone because I'm in the car, just let me know. Go off mute and tell me. But yeah, so I guess there was an introduction earlier, but my name is Leah Thomas, also known as Green Girl Leah on the internet. If anyone follows me on social media, give me a little up, or if you follow Intersectional Environmentalist, thank you. Please follow us. I saw a couple hands. That's awesome. But yeah, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and like I mentioned earlier, I've always been really passionate about the earth, but it wasn't because I wanted to be an environmental scientist. It was just because that's what me and my family did in our own way. We didn't go camping or any of those kind of outdoorsy things, but we had our own outdoor experiences that were special to us. So gardening with my grandmother in her backyard, even sitting on her patio was a way that I connected with nature. Reusing and recycling and mending, that's something that was always a part of my, family history. So I guess you could say maybe I was an environmentalist, and so was my mom and my grandma, but we just didn't know it. And the reality is that's pretty true for a lot of people. A lot of communities of color have cultural traditions that are already infused within their culture of reusing and recycling and, organic-ish, farming practices. So hindsight is 2020. Even though I didn't think I was an outdoorsy person, that's just because what you see in the mainstream media or within the outdoor industry paints a really specific kind of look to what it means to be an environmentalist, someone who goes off into the wilderness for days at a time and turns off their cell phone. A National Park Service ranger. I've been a ranger, it was fun. But that's not accessible to all people. And that, one kind of dominating narrative is incorrect because it kind of stresses that we have to leave our communities and our neighborhoods in order to find nature, when in reality, nature is all around us and our cities are ecosystems within themselves. So I think that's something that I learned along my journey when I was studying environmental science formally, in college, formally. And I just was learning all of these things about different types of environmentalism, but I was seeing a real lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially of people of color and women of color and their contributions to the environmental movement. And I learned about the same people over and over again. I just wrote a piece for Vogue, which I hope they publish and don't, they're probably going to edit it. But I started it out with, I don't want to read about John Muir anymore. And it's not because, his story isn't great, but within environmental education, you learn about him. And you learn about a lot of kind of white, male conservationists, but the stories aren't often infused with the stories of women and queer folks and people of color. And that lack of representation is having a really serious impact on, one, who's attracted to environmentalism, because if more people saw themselves reflected in environmental history and curriculums, that would probably motivate a lot of people to say, oh, this is something I want to do. My ancestors have done this. People who look like me have been a part of it. But we don't have that right now because a lot of environmental programs are not diverse. And in addition to that, only sharing certain perspectives and narratives is just not okay, for a lot of different reasons that we'll get into. So yeah, that really motivated me to start writing and trying to uncover those stories that I knew were there the whole time. So I spent a lot of my time in college trying to uncover those unsung heroes, and I stumbled across the mother and the father of environmental justice, who one is named Hazel M. Johnson. She was an incredible Black woman from Chicago, and she was one of the first people to identify that toxic waste sites and facilities were primarily in Latinx and Black communities. And Dr. Robert Bullard, who was the first person to do even more studies about environmental justice, correlating race to environmental inequality. So I kept uncovering those stories, and it was really empowering for me to understand that I had a place within the environmental movement. But over time, I just knew that these were stories that I shouldn't keep to myself, or stories that should be hard to find. Because if I can easily learn about John Muir, I should easily be able to learn about queer ecologists and learning about the disability rights movement in the United States and how that intersected with environmentalism. I always just thought that everyone should see themselves reflected in environmental education. So I dabbled in a couple different jobs, mostly working in environmental communications. And that basically means just writing about environmentalism, trying to reach as many people as possible, because I think we need more climate communicators that are not just, speaking in academic speak that no one can understand. I want everyone to know about the climate crisis and environmentalism, and I want it to be as accessible as possible. So that's how I kind of found my niche somewhere with climate and communications, accessibility, and social media, all these things. To mix them up together, and that's what I do. I just kept feeling like it just wasn't enough in the environmental community. There was a lot of, environmentalists that thought that they didn't have to advocate for the lives and well-being of people of color within the context of their work. And it was really confusing to me as a Black environmentalist, because I went to protest for endangered salmon. I went to protest for the tiniest of organisms, and environmentalists were like, yeah, we love to save the salmon. But the second it came to the Black Lives Matter movement, also, sorry, if my screen, okay, there we go. Am I back the right way? Okay. So when it came to the Black Lives Matter movement, Stop Asian Hate movement, immigrants' rights movements, like women's rights movement, it just was funny to me that the same people who would take it to the streets to march for salmon said, the people thing, like, I just don't do that, and I'm like, well, why? Because humans are on this planet, and there are humans who are endangered. And I feel like in the context of our work as environmentalists, we should also care about people. And that sounds so obvious, but it's not. And it's having devastating impacts around the country and around the world, because not valuing humans, I guess one example, if we take it back to salmon, because that's stuck in my head because I went to that protest and I'm just like, why? I don't regret it, but okay. But if we think about endangered salmon, for example, if you're not thinking intersectionally, you might just say, oh, these salmon are endangered. How can we make the salmon not endangered? But if you're thinking intersectionally, you would say, the salmon are endangered. Are there indigenous communities that rely on these salmon for food, and how is that impacting those people? Let's think about economics. Are there fishermen, local fishermen in the area who also rely on the salmon to feed their families, etc.? Okay, the salmon are endangered. How's the water quality? Where is this water running off to? How is this impacting the local ecosystem, etc.? So thinking intersectionally, it's not like you are just adding social justice somewhere that it doesn't need to be. It's just thinking as comprehensively as possible. It's never going to be perfect, just to understand how people, the planet, and animals and surrounding ecosystems are impacted by something, so you can have the most comprehensive solutions. Because say you took even one of those things out of the equation and didn't consider. So if you're not considering the impact on these endangered salmon for indigenous peoples, then unintentionally you could create policies that were harmful to that community. Or say that community is struggling with food apartheid, where they don't have access to healthy food, and that was all that they could rely on. It's really important to consider people in the equation. So over time, I really was just frustrated that a lot of environmentalists sometimes they're very hostile. I speak about this pretty calmly, but over the course of the last 5 years, I've had white male environmentalists yell at me and other Black, Indigenous people of color, kind of saying that racism is something that can come, we can maybe address that later, or that's something for racial justice advocates to do. I've also seen it in the funding. Unfortunately, less than 5% of all philanthropic funds that go to environmental work go specifically to climate justice, and less than 2% go specifically to Black and Indigenous-led organizations, and even less to Black and Indigenous women. So organizations that are trying so hard to improve the livelihoods for people of color, low-income people, queer folks, etc., other unheard voices, are not getting funding. And the majority of that funding is going to conservation or the kind of mainstream environmentalism that you hear about. And yes, I want to save the whales, and I think that that's amazing, but it's hard when WWF, PETA, the Sierra Club, organizations I've worked with, are working with budgets of over $200 million a year that are more conservation focused, and environmental justice organizations that are trying to improve the livelihoods of people are working with a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So there's a lot of inequity in the environmental space, and a lot of the work that I do is trying to educate people on why it's important to consider people, and not only that, to uplift the stories of people of color and diverse communities within the environmental movement. Because one, representation is important for so many different reasons. I think everyone deserves to have themselves reflected in the curriculums that they are studying, because what a treat that would be. Two, because a lot of Black and Brown and Indigenous communities already have the solutions to the problems that they are facing, but they just need amplification and support. So if people can get connected to the climate justice orgs in their community, I know I've had so many instances where I had no idea there was a terrible environmental injustice happening down the street because it's not in the local news. How else would I know about it? They need amplification and support. So that's why I think we need to start learning about climate justice. And lastly, we need everyone to save and protect the planet. There's no reason that climate information should kind of be gatekept, whether that's in academic institutions or only available for a certain amount of people to understand. This information should be as obvious, as clear, as accessible, as culturally competent as possible, because it's really going to take all of us. And lastly, not even just about the doom and gloom of saving the planet. I just think there's a lot of joy that can come from people understanding how their cultures practice environmentalism in a really unique way, and they can find empowerment, like I said earlier, from realizing, oh, I never even thought about the way that my grandma and how she reuses, plastic bags, or how she puts, other things that's not butter inside of a butter container, and saying like that is environmentalism. And I think there's a lot of empowerment that can come from kind of reclaiming those narratives for ourselves. So that's what led me to write my book, which is in the back of my car somewhere. But I hope you all check it out. It's called The Intersectional Environmentalist. I'm not sure if you'll have copies or not. And it's all about this. It's all about environmental justice and the importance of not leaving anyone out from the environmental conversation. And I left my job at Patagonia, and I hope this can inspire you all. Please, if you have a job, you don't have to leave it dramatically. But it was during the summer of 2020. I was furloughed, which is kind of like a temporary break in employment. And I really had nothing else to lose, but part of me just thought, you know what? I just got an offer to come back to my job for a raise, actually, a significant raise, but I could try to start an organization, and I'm going to do it. And I could try to write a book. So I was on unemployment for months, not knowing what I was doing, but I just knew that it was so important to raise awareness about intersectional environmentalism and see where it could go. And I'm so glad that I made that decision, because now it's an organization with over 400,000 community members and a strong kind of following base on social media. We have a podcast, multiple films, a book that I was able to write, and curriculums around the world are being changed, not just because of us, but because of this like momentum that's happening completely outside of me and the organization. There are students that are demanding, wanting to learn about climate justice, even, people like you all that are taking time on your Sunday to learn about intersectional environmentalism. So it's kind of a cool underground, it's not underground, it's kind of mainstream, but kind of underground, bubbling educational movement that's happening that makes me really excited, and I'm glad that I get to be a part of. So yeah, that's a little bit of my spiel. I know that didn't last as long as I would have hoped, but I'd love to get into a Q&A if you all have any questions.
Yeah, I know we're all so inspired by the work that you've been doing, and after hearing from your point of view, all of what drove you to create these resources for students like us to use, it's really cool, and we're so excited to hear more about what you've been doing. I know that we have some questions prepared, and some questions that have arose. I'd love to turn it over to the rest of the people in this call and see if they have anything that they want to ask Leah.
One of the questions that I had was, so we're trying to start the Greater Twin Cities High School Environmental Coalition, and we're wanting to incorporate intersectionality as a core tenet of that, but we're just wondering if you have any advice on how we can do that without it just being a performative buzzword and actually have it be a practice and something that we're active on.
Yeah, this is a really great question. There were a lot of organizations after kind of the buzz of the intersectional environmentalist movement that just added intersectionality to their platforms. I remember Fridays for Future, it was almost overnight, all of a sudden it was an intersectional student. It was really cool, that makes me happy, but I don't want people to just add it, like you said, without really assessing whether or not this space is intersectional. And I think you all are at the perfect time. There's a writer and activist named Adrienne Marie Brown, and she talks about always defining the intention of a space. And the intention can shift. It will shift because that's just what happens. Things don't stay static. But yeah, having some time to talk about that with a group of people of what does intersectionality mean to us. This is what it might mean to me, Leah, so you can use that as a basis, but it's going to mean something very different to you all based on the demographics of your school, the area, the different environmental justice issues that you all are facing. So have those conversations, and then you can also think about what does that mean in terms of leadership? Who are some of the people that we want to make sure, I don't know if there's a council or a leadership group, how many people are on that council. And it's really not about quotas or anything like that, so I don't want you all to think about it that way, because I feel like that feels negative, but just understanding that if we want to build an intersectional organization, how can we make this as diverse of a coalition as possible? And really thinking about different things, is there a climate justice religious person? I speak at churches sometimes, even though I'm not religious, because there's some people who deeply in their faith and spiritual practice care about the earth, and they have really unique perspectives and can mobilize a really specific community. Making sure that there are people of color present, hopefully, that would be amazing, and not just present, but they have decision-making power within that group and within that space, I think is really important. But yeah, just taking some time to define what that means to you and how you can be accountable to that. So yeah, I would need to learn a little bit more about what your scope of work is, and then I could help a little bit more. If you have any more information, let me know.
Well, yeah, we've been trying to work to connect students within our greater Hennepin County area, and we're trying to create a network for environmental clubs to get the resources that they need to be able to build different programming. And because we've all been encountering similar issues with having to coordinate with administration and having to organize, like just all of the things that come up when you're in the position of organizing. We wanted to be able to tackle those challenges together and not have to like go through it individually when we could be working together. And so I think in doing that, we also want to figure out how we can diversify like our outreach and also like the kind of programming we have, but as well like the kind of people that we're reaching.
Yeah, one primary issue that we've faced is a lot of the schools in our area and the ones that we're specifically targeting have unintentionally been private schools. So that's definitely something that we realize is very much should be the top of our list in terms of like how to make our space more of like an inclusive setting that has, you know, more perspectives than just the most privileged.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I went to a private high school, but you would find, like, sometimes at private schools, like, there are a lot of people of color that might be, like, the only or one of few. And if you all are able to provide a safe space for them, I think that is incredibly important. So also thinking about that, like, okay, maybe what we're working with is this. And I say this all the time, like, for example, so there's a group of people in Beverly Hills, and they decide that they want to be climate justice advocates of Beverly Hills. And the truth of the matter is, they're in Beverly Hills. And the first step is just to acknowledge that this is what it is. This is what we're working with. We know that we are very privileged in these sorts of ways. But even if this collective is primarily made of people from Beverly Hills, how can we make sure our work doesn't stop there? So it's not necessarily about people in Beverly Hills, and this is an extreme example, deciding like, okay, we need to go over to Inglewood and like bridge the gap and like invite people to come, etc. Because it's like, would that be the most culturally like safe space for them in this present moment? Like maybe sometimes, but there could be ways that that community can use their privilege in some ways to help communities that are more impacted by climate injustice. So I would say if what you're working with to start is private schools, that's okay. But make it a really inclusive space because there are lots of like queer folks at private schools that feel like they don't have community. There are BIPOC that feel like they don't have community, etc. And if you come in and say like we are a safe space for all these sorts of things, you can build a really cool kind of niche coalition even if you're working with primarily private schools. So keeping that in mind.
Yeah, that's really insightful for focusing on creating community rather than trying to build or trying to change the type of space that you have. Another, I guess in that vein about kind of framing environmentalism, how would you address the kind of view that people have of environmentalism as being kind of separate from all of those movements? So when a lot of the time when we've presented programming at our school, I feel like there isn't that much interest in, or like there's kind of like a dismissive tone that people have towards environmentalism because they don't understand the intersectionality. So how do you draw people in for that conversation so that you can explain how it intersects with all of these other movements that they might also be quite passionate about? But like, how do you take that first step?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. And yeah, showing people how it kind of relates to them. I think there's a lot of narrative and storytelling undoing that we have to do as kind of like modern day environmentalists because it's so ingrained into the narrative that one, environmentalism is all about conservation and going into national parks, and two, that environmentalism and sustainability is consumer driven, so it's something that you can buy your way into. People now are very familiar with, okay, there's eco-friendly packaging, things like this, I need to buy a Tesla, I need to get Tupperware, but it's very wrapped around consumerism. So that's unfortunate because both of those things we know are not true. It's not about buying your way into sustainability or summiting a mountain. So there's a lot of narrative undoing that kind of falls onto us. And what I've seen that's really helpful is meeting people where they're at and what they're interested in. We're doing with my nonprofit like a concert series with two small artists and musicians and poets, and they have their own like following. And then we're, not secretly, but we're also bringing in some nonprofits. So people might just go to this concert because they just want to go to this concert. But in the middle of the show, there's going to be an educational panel, and each of the artists are going to talk about environmental justice. Or last night, so Billie Eilish's mom, it's kind of a roundabout thing, but Billie Eilish's mom, Maggie, is actually really cool. And she's a vegan environmental activist for like years, and works with her kids to like make their tours the most sustainable tours, I would say, arguably in the world. And last night, shout out to Maggie, she invited like me and a couple other nonprofits to just like table at the concert. And there are a lot of other artists that are doing that, where they're bringing people who are coming for the music, and then they happen to learn about climate. So I feel like, especially if you have events or things like that, make it a topic that people want to learn about anyway. So you could talk about like thrifting, you could talk about sustainable fashion, and then just kind of infuse some other things into there. You could throw a program that's about like poetry or writing, but the topic at hand is about environmentalism. And even if you spend just like a short amount of time at first just saying like, did you know that people don't have access to trees, and tree cover is related to income and race? So today we're going to be journaling about trees or something like that. So like kind of these subtle ways to bring people in. I would also say fear is something that I guess we should stay away from for the most part. I think there's a lot of, again, storytelling that we have to undo, because a lot of environmentalism is very doom focused, saving the future, scary, shaming people, etc. And if you can do the opposite and you're leading with compassion and optimism and showing people really cool solutions, I feel like that gets people in a little bit more. So yeah, just try your hardest to meet people where they're at. And I work with my words, kind of a last piece of advice. So of course I love saying intersectional environmentalism. It's like intersectional, it's like 12 syllables. It's really fun to say, but I also know that a lot of people have no idea what that means. And it's not a make it or break it for me. Like, people can understand that topic with completely different words. And I'm more than willing to say, like, caring about people on the planet for a certain audience of people, because I don't want to lose anyone with like environmental or social justice speak. And then I think, when people are more familiar, then you can start talking about these things. But I think meeting people where they're at is so important. Just like, do you care about the protection of people on the planet? Like, are you passionate about anti-racism? Well, did you know that this is impacting, like, kind of those sorts of segues? Yeah, those are a couple of things to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a really great way to go about it, like meeting people where they're at and segueing into more like the different types of topics. Yeah, that's really cool. I guess if anyone has questions that they don't want to or if they don't want to unmute and ask questions, you can also put your questions in the chat. If you can raise your hand if you have a question, just so that we can get this going with incorporating everyone. Yeah, so I think we'll continue with this Q&A format for the rest of the time, if that's okay with you.
I have a question. What are some instances that you've faced like pushback to your work or people disagreeing with you?
Ooh, there's so many. I'm trying to see where I should start. Yeah, there's always someone who, okay, so this is really interesting. People are more likely to think that environmental injustices, some people, kind of like privileged people, that environmental injustice is linked to income, but refuse to believe that it's linked to race. So you see this a lot within racial justice movements, especially in conversations about privilege. So specifically when I'm talking about like white conservationists, they can relate to economic inequality, because there are white people in the United States that are impoverished and are struggling. But some people who are white with privilege might not be able to identify with racial inequality. Mm-hmm. So they don't believe that racial equality, they believe it's like over-exaggerated or something like that, etc. So they might come around and they could say, oh yeah, I can get behind that. People, regardless of income, should have trees and clean air and clean water, etc. And I think it's because they could say, I could be this person, but then the second that it becomes something that they put the fault on other people, or it's race, it's something that they can't relate to in the same way, saying, oh, this is actually linked to income, this has nothing to do with race. And that's something that really frustrates me, and it manifests a lot because it's really dismissive, but it puts the blame on people of color specifically for these conditions. And I have to talk about like compounding factors because it's not always either or, and that's the beauty of intersectionality. We don't have single identities, we have multiple facets and parts of our identity, but I don't know how much pushback I've gotten to that, saying these factors are actually compounding. And sometimes race has a bigger influence than income because there are middle class Black communities that still struggle with environmental injustice just because they're located in formerly redlined communities. So communities that used to be, segregated where only, Black people could rent. And then like the better communities, only white people could rent. So that's a tricky one. And that's why intersectional theory is really important. I've also done a lot of conservation-focused environmentalists that, again, I think it's racism. I know it's racism, but kind of they view animals as innocent in all of this. So when it comes to the climate, they can easily say that animals are innocent, and I agree. So when it comes to their endangerment or their, habitats being destroyed, a lot of environmentalists really get passionate about it. When it comes to people, especially Black and brown people around the world, it's that same racism that thinks that maybe it's that person's fault. So when I tell people about the pollution in certain neighborhoods, I get people that say, well, why don't you move if it's not so great? Things like that to historically Black and brown and Asian communities that are experiencing these injustices. It's that tendency to empathize so much with animals, but humans not doing the same thing. And that's the disconnect within a lot of kind of mainstream environmentalism that caused me to want to gravitate towards intersectional environmentalism, because I don't want to take part in a type of environmentalism that doesn't also equally value human lives. And I think that gets down to saviorism as well. A lot of people are attracted to philanthropy or environmentalism or conservation because they can pat themselves on the back really easily. They can say that they help save whales or something like that, and it's very, they view these as innocent beings that are in need of saving, and they're okay when it comes to saviorism and like orphanages in Africa, which again is really problematic, or when they feel like they can save someone. But then just being so harsh on Black and brown communities globally that they feel like don't deserve saving, by saying, you know what, I don't care about racial justice in the context of my work. So there's a lot to deconstruct there, but I hope that makes sense. I think it's a lot of saviorism that's at play, or people kind of grappling with identity and privilege.
Sorry.
Oh, Jason.
Yeah, Jason, do you want to ask your question, like, speak it out?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I have a question is that, according to what you said about the example about salmon and the native and their relation with natives, and I'm wondering because, from the instances you've been given, what I heard is that it's a question about we are or people in relationship with space, and then of course to the plants and animals of the given area. But then it also makes me wonder, like, what about for example immigrants that that or of the people that are, because we're an incredible proceeding level of mobility. And with the transportations, and so I'm wondering, like, what about people who, that does not have a very stable sort of given area, or how about like people just travel around, rambling around, so yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, this is a great question. I want to make sure I understand it fully. So is this specifically asking about people who, for example, might, so they might immigrate and then they live in a particular like community, but it's not like the same level of connection to the land where they're literally relying on like salmon, etc.?
Well, it's more like, because, it's easy to understand, for example, if native people, because they've been living and they had a strong connection with their land. But, to a recent sort of degree, we have people that just, does not have it, and they just moving around between place to places. And also because of our mobility, we also does not believe to a certain assigned area, about those people. So yeah, that's what I'm sort of wondering about.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I took an environmental ethics class in school that I think was really interesting and everyone should consider. And I think even the way that this question is framed, I do that often because I forget, again, that our neighborhoods and our cities are also ecosystems in some ways. And I think it's easier, like you said, as a starting point to kind of refer to people who coexist with the land to better paint a picture of, see, we historically as people are not existing separate from nature. And then I think also carrying that sentiment wherever you are, even in urban environments. So thinking about urban environments also being ecosystems that can be healthy or not healthy in the same way. So something a little bit more literal would even just be water quality and what's coming out of the tap. So regardless of where you are, or even if you're traveling, whether you're in a suburban area or an urban environment, the water quality can be really, really different, especially when we're talking about things like race and income, or whether you're in an urban environment. Also, your pollution exposure will go up in specific areas. So in the book, I think it's chapter 4, I break down data for specific communities. So I talk about Black American communities, AAPI communities, Latinx communities, Indigenous communities, etc. Statistics that are specifically impacting these groups of people in very different ways. And the concentration of people by racial demographics, it happens for a couple different reasons. Like one is because of redlining and just segregation in the past. There are a lot of communities that are just primarily a certain race. And then also just culture. Sometimes it just naturally happens, especially when we're talking about immigration. There in California, for example, we have like Little Ethiopia and Koreatown and Little Armenia, etc. Like people tend to concentrate around people who can remind them of their own culture. That's not all the time. But because of that, we also start to see specific environmental injustices that are impacting those specific areas. And I break down that data in the book. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I'm kind of challenging myself to rethink that our cities are still ecosystems, and the water quality that we're drinking, the air that we're breathing, all of those things. We should think about that. Does that answer it somewhat?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Another question I had was, so intersectional environmentalism and climate justice is something that I think is interesting and something that we want to be involved in for a lot of us. What are like college majors or college paths that would help to prepare us for careers in those types of fields?
Yeah, and right now, like I am trying to petition for universities to add environmental justice as like a mandatory course offering, because it's not actually mandatory for most universities. It's usually an elective, so that's something to keep in mind. Like if you specifically want to study climate justice, making sure that there's a program where it's kind of mandatory, that's really important. But some classes that I didn't realize helped me so much would be like sociology. Amazing, like the study of people, privilege, etc. I think is really important. So if you can take a soc class, please do. I took a class that touched on ecofeminism, which was really interesting and I think helped me learn about intersectional environmentalism or formulate what it meant to me. Because I think ecofeminism is the perfect example of looking at power struggles and privilege specific to gender and looking at the treatment of women in society and how that connects with the treatment of the planet. And when you see certain societies that degrade and exploit women, oftentimes those same societies will hold similar sentiments and exploit the planet. So it's just a really interesting framework for me to think intersectionally about how societies value both people and the planet. I think environmental policy classes are also important just to get a general understanding of what environmental policies are right now, but then understanding how some of those policies are also being not regulated equally for all people. But I will say that it's growing. A lot of curriculums are being reshaped right now that are becoming more intersectional in nature. So I don't know what grade you all are in right now, but by the time you go to college, I think it will be a little bit more mandatory in curriculum. So hopefully it'll be a lot easier for you all.
Yeah. Oh, and what college did you go to?
So I went to Chapman University. I wouldn't recommend it, but it was really fun. I mean, it was cool, but I think there are better environmental programs. But I say all that to say, I didn't go to like a top tier program. And honestly, you could study whatever and just take a couple environmental classes and be really involved with like local environmental organizing, because we need environmentalists that, you know, do different things. Someone told me once every movement needs an accountant, which is kind of funny, but we do. We need someone who's really good at numbers and books and skilled, and they can use that skill for the movements that they care about. So if there's something that you really like, say you love writing and you want to be like a writing major, do that, and then maybe get a minor in environmental studies. So you don't have to study environmental science to be an environmental scientist, but I would recommend having a cluster, a minor, or taking a couple of classes if you don't do the full-on major.
Cool. Another question I was wondering about kind of connects to what you were saying earlier about like the eco-feminism thing. So I don't know if this is just an anomaly, but my school's environmental club is like 95% people who identify as women. So how can we, I guess at least for my school, how can we get more men involved or boys involved in environmentalism?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend learning about ecofeminism. There's a chapter in my book because it's so interesting how so we take it all the way back to creation theories and religion. There's a lot of sentiment about like Mother Earth or earth goddesses, etc. Even in the Bible, there's very kind of like women-centric language when we're talking about the environment. So I think that has shaped that for some reason, which I don't like a whole lot, is that women have to be like the protectors of the earth. So it doesn't matter how much the patriarchy like destroys and extracts from the earth and society, somehow women are supposed to be the quote unquote like nurturers. So this is really wrapped up in a lot of gender roles, and I think in ecofeminism, you'll see cultural ecofeminism, which talks about these gender roles a little bit more and why they're there from, creation theories, etc. And there's radical ecofeminism, which is a bit more modern, which is trying to, dismantle the patriarchy. It's really cool. We'll get into it. So, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of undoing in society just because of gender roles and the patriarchy being really exploitative to both the planet and women, that sometimes like men put the responsibility on nurturing the planet on women, which is so unfair. So I don't know the strategy behind it, how to get more men involved, because it's like they are involved and then they get a lot more attention, which doesn't make sense. There's so many women who are in this fight for the planet, but then you think of people like Al Gore or even Leonardo DiCaprio, etc., when women's emotional labor for decades, if not centuries, has gone into protecting the planet. So there's a lot we have to dismantle there. But I would say, I don't know, there are a lot of men who want to be feminists, so hopefully they can be eco-feminists at the same time and use their privilege in some ways to amplify the voices of women. But I don't know, that's a hard one. We'll have to see.
I have a question. So a lot of I guess when we like get frustrated from like the dismissive actions of like our classmates, we often fall into like more of a fear-mongering path, which, I mean, it comes partly from our own like eco-anxiety, and I guess how do we avoid leading with hope without making our classmates feel complacent? And
Yeah.
Because it feels so easy, like in positions of power, to like choose not to see how other people are affected by climate change more so than yourself. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally feel this. I hadn't tabled for a long time until I did the concert last night, and it was so hard to get people to stop that were on their way to a Billie Eilish concert to talk about the climate. And we had a sign, and I got so frustrated. There's one moment where I was like, Billie cares about the climate. If you're her real fan, like, come over here. And we were like, we're separating the real from the real and the fake from the fake. And it was kind of funny, but then thinking back on it, I was like, they're not going to stop when I'm angry at them. Like, it's so frustrating because it made me sad just to see how many people really just didn't care. But then I started to think, maybe it's not that they don't care, it's just that I'm kind of interrupting them in a space where this conversation normally wouldn't happen, so maybe I'm catching them off guard. But what did work was, hey, we've got some biodegradable stickers. Anybody want some stickers? Like, this is really fun. And then we got them over there, we started talking. We have one sticker that says the Sustainable Baddies Club. It's just kind of a funny one that we have at a nonprofit. So we started switching it. We're like, you look like a sustainable baddie. Do you thrift? Did you get that thrifted? Something like that. So it started out with something that made people like laugh and smile. And that actually attracted more people to want to listen to us. So I would say, be funny, be fun, use memes, use humor, use hope, those sorts of things. Because people are more receptive to that, and they're more willing to stay in a movement for longer if it's fueled by joy and laughter versus something that's fueled by fear. And I think that's what my organization, Intersectional Environmentalist, we try to do all those things. We want to be 80% joy, and the other part, you know, we'll talk about the real of what's going on, but have more joy and more solutions than the doom and gloom. I'll get people, you know, going.
Quick question. So you mentioned earlier that you have like a book and then you also have some films. Where would we be able to find those films?
So the films, I think most of them are student-led, which is pretty cool because they were made by some college students. So if you go on YouTube, there should be one. It's called The Intersectional History of Environmentalism. That's the one that I refer out to people that was created. And then we have a new podcast that's coming out. But I would follow Intersectional Environmentalist for most things. We also just came out with a zine, which is really fun. So we have a new climate justice magazine that's really cute. And then my book, it's called The Intersectional Environmentalist. So yeah, and then, oh sweet, so someone put the film in there. And I think this one is extra special to me because there were students who wanted to kind of reshape how environmental history was taught. And they created a timeline project that took months. We had a photographer, thanks for the books. We had a photographer retouch photos from the civil rights movement that were in black and white and put color to them. So it's, I think, a really good starting point.
Yeah, it's been so exciting hearing about your new book, and like I love when you're referring back to chapters. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Margaret, for getting, that was our librarian. So just when you're referring back to chapters, hearing that we can like learn about all these different topics that you've been bringing up, I know I've learned so much, and I'm definitely so inspired by the work you've been doing. One last question, just to round this off. I know you've described yourself and the Intersectional Environmentalist organization as a whole as being climate optimistic. And so how do you stay like optimistic in the face of all of these injustices and in the face of being shot down and not being heard? Like, how do you maintain your optimistic look on environmentalism and share that with your community?
I think it's a lot of reverse psychology, to be honest. I would say that I started thinking about joy as an act of activism. This stems from a group called the NAP, like napping, the NAP Ministries, and their whole thing is that resting is actually a radical act. Like in the world that we live in, that is so chaotic and so many injustices happening, taking the time to care for yourself and practice self-care in spite of all of that is actually pretty revolutionary and a way to stick it to the man. So I added on top of that joy is also a radical act and a part of my activism. How radical is it to not let all of this chaos take away your ability to experience joy? So I think that's what keeps me positive. Like, I'm not going to let all of this chaos of a climate crisis that I really didn't even create and you all didn't create, I'm not going to let that take my joy away from me. And I think I also get that from my ancestors, like being an African American in this country. If my great-grandmother could find joy, so can I. A woman who lived through segregation and, was born not too long after slavery, my great-grandmother, etc., if she could find joy, and if she could be a dancer and do all of those things, and so could my grandma and my parents that lived through, segregation, who am I to not find joy? So I think that's how I chill a little bit, thinking about my ancestors, and also just saying, you know what, joy and rest, that's part of my activism. So I'm being an activist by experiencing joy. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for taking time out of your day to come meet with us. It's been wonderful having you here. Yeah, thank you so much.
We are very excited to read the book.
Yeah.
Yes, very excited.
Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on your book publishing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you. You all are so cool. Stay in touch and let me know how the coalition is going. And just follow up with us on Instagram. If I'm ever in your city, I'll let you all know. And shout out to whoever organized this. I just see so many bright organizers on this phone call right now, and I'm just so stoked for what you all are going to do. And thanks for letting me join from my car. At least we got some plants in the background. That was nice. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.